Hello, everybody. I'm here in the office. Uh, as you can see on the news, if you live in this area, we got clobbered here in New England with a huge blizzard. If you've lived in New England most of your life, like I have, it's nothing out of the ordinary from what I've seen in the past. It was pretty brutal, however, a lot of heavy snow, and it's taken a toll on my ability to make videos. So I figured for tonight, um, instead of the usual firearms stuff, I wanted to do a part one. So, just a fair warning, this is just a talking video. I will be talking about knives. And for this part, since I can't show you any of the forging techniques that I would want to show on camera to give you guys a little bit of a visual enjoyment, um, this is going to be a long talking video. I'm going to try and explain the idea behind heat treating and tempering. I'll probably go off track a little bit, but I want to give some examples. I have a piece of paper here. I'm going to draw my examples so I can show you. So, what is heat treating? Essentially, you can't make a knife out of any kind of metal and think it's going to last. Obviously, the original cavemen used to make knives out of stones and flint and different types of rock or whatever. Then we had the Bronze Age. People discovered how to make bronze, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through the whole history of blades and knife making here. Current day, 2026, where we're in now, the trajectory of knife making has gone towards more designer steel. The main thing with that is that the average guy like me isn't going to be able to get a hold of some of these steels, or if I do, it's going to cost a lot of money. The big fad for a while was Damascus. I know a lot of people, and I might be pronouncing it wrong. I know a lot of people like Damascus steel knives. If you go on Amazon or on the internet, there's a lot of fake Damascus steel knives to be aware of. If you're seeing one for 20 bucks, it's probably not real Damascus steel. That's a layering process, and what people tend to do for that is mix high carbon, nickel, chromium, different types of metals, and then put them in a solution in order to bring out the pattern. While all that is well and good, I would get into it. It's more for show pieces. If you're a beginner and want to get into knife making, I wouldn't start out with something so difficult as Damascus or something like that. I would even call myself a beginner in certain terms. I've learned how to use a coal forge first. I got that maybe 20 years ago. I learned how to use a coal forge. That's a challenge. A lot of burning through metal and knives. And I'll explain how that happens too here. Within the last couple of years, believe it or not, I finally treated myself to a propane forge, or a gas forge as it's commonly referred to. Now, I do everything outside. I don't have a big shop or anything like that. I've moved my shop a few times, so it's been difficult to really get a permanent structure / shop going. So I've stuck to my old ways and kind of harvested my metal from scrap, kind of set up little makeshift work areas and stuff like that. And I'm sure that's taken away from my ability to make higher quality blade. And the main thing here is, if you're a beginner, you got to work with what you got. So before I get too far ahead of myself, let me go back to the main topic here, tempering or heat treating. So ideally, you're going to want to have a high carbon steel to start with. Now, when I was starting out, the first blade I ever made, maybe, 20 years ago, was out of a file. I don't know if you can see this too well, but I used the file. I think it was a Nichols file, blah, and a piece of antler that I found in the woods. So I won't go into much detail about how this is made, but basically you drill out the center. It has a rat tail tang, which I'll draw out on here for you. So basically a rat tail is a type of tang. If you're using like a grip material that doesn't allow for a full tang, which is something like this, where the spine goes all the way down through the handle. I don't know if you can see that, but the spine goes all the way down and it's wide. That gives a lot more structure to the blade. As a matter of fact, right here I have an example of somewhat of a rat tail. I wouldn't call it that. It's for stacked leather. You can see here I got a piece of leather that will be stacked, and then I'll have, once I figure out a way to smelt some aluminum or something and put it in there, I'll have a nice little stacked leather with brass accent blade here. So pretty much, let me finish my drawing real quick. You can see here, this is the hilt area, and this is basically a rat tail, and that protrudes down into the bone or the antler, what have you. So you're going to be using epoxy and stuff like that. So a good example of high carbon steel, like I said, I'll get off track a little bit, is exactly this, a file. So some people will start out with a file. I have an example of that here. This blank is a little rusted, but this is a horse rasp, or horse, for doing horseshoeing file. You can see the little pattern in there. It's a high carbon steel. This guy here is made out of a spring steel, like a 5940 or something like that. And this guy here is made from an old sawmill blade from the 1800s. Now, I wouldn't go out to Harbor Freight and buy yourself a saw blade. I'm talking a big sawmill blade that's made with good steel. Now, this steel here is what I like to work with. This is I would put this at a 1085. You got 1095, 1075. I'd put this at a 1085. So as you go down from 1095, 1085, 1075, you're going from hardness to softness. So 1095 being the hardest, 1075 being the softest. Why does that matter? So there's a trade-off. For example, if I were to, let's say, stab this into a log and bend it, that tip has some durability to it. And what that allows for is for me to do somewhat of a pry without worrying about snapping this blade in half or the tip as much as I would a more brittle, hard brittle 1095. 1095 though, don't get me wrong, is one of the best materials you can use for a blade. very tough, but there's a lot of upkeep. You got to keep these oiled up. Otherwise, you're going to get flash rusting. So I'll explain how that all works. Essentially, there's the very first process that you have to do when tempering steel before you work with it is a process called annealing, which means when I heat this up to red hot and let it cool, it loses its hardness. So we're talking around a cherry red to an orange. Some go non-magnetic. So basically it gets so hot that a magnet won't stick to it. As long as it's at least cherry red, I find that you can anneal pretty well. You can tell if a blade's annealed when you're sanding, and in a future video I'll show and explain this. When you're sanding, you'll see the sparks have a different throw. They'll go out in a different way. So a harder blade will have shorter throw, and an annealed piece of steel will have long throw. And that also has to do with the carbon content. So first you have annealing, softening the metal to work with it. Because you have a couple factors going on. You have work hardening, I can't say it, work hardening, say that 5 times fast, where if you were to hammer onto the steel cold, what's happening is you're creating a condition. You're creating a condition with the steel where basically it's getting compounded tightly like a checkerboard. So I'll draw that out, and this is going to explain how carbon works in a blade. So you have a checkerboard. So this is the stable structure of the steel. I don't know if you can see this. Perfect squares. So we're talking at like a molecular level here. And I'm sorry if this gets a little too advanced. So at a molecular level, you have a structure of steel where it's in its natural state. So steel is a man-made mix of metals, as we know, but in its natural molecular form, it's very much like you can consider it like a checkerboard. Each one of these squares, so think of like the eye of a fly, the amount of, like if you ever seen a fly or a dragonfly up close, their eye, you're talking that tenfold or a millionfold at a molecular level on a piece of steel. So the carbon atoms are so small that this checkerboard I'm drawing out doesn't really give it justice. So I'll draw this piece of steel out as if it were a piece of 1085 carbon. How about that? So each one of these circles, my checker pieces, represent the molecular level of the carbon atoms within the cellular structure of the steel. Okay? So now, like I was saying before, the importance of annealing is that when you heat something, it expands, and when you harden something or freeze it, we're using heat here, but obviously we're dropping the hot steel into cold oil or water, you're contracting. So in its stable state, you have the structure of the steel. Now these empty spaces represent a lower carbon content. If I was to be showing 1095, for example, to keep it simple, you'd have a couple more carbon atoms in here. So what is the carbon atom? That gives it hardness. And each one of these empty structures gives you durability in the form of dexterity, flexibility of the steel. So now, if I were to just take this piece of steel and start hammering on it without heating it or annealing or softening it. So annealing is more for sanding so that you're not working with super tight structure. It's more dense, so the sandpaper is not going to make its way to eat into the metal. So we're opening it up a little bit, and now we have this at this level here. So now I've started banging on the metal. I didn't heat it up. The natural state of the steel wants to be hard, rigid. So as I hammer, I'll do my best to represent this. What's basically happening is I'm forcing it out of its natural state, the checker squares, onto the checkers, the carbon atoms, and kind of crushing everything. It goes a little wacky here. So you can see here, it's not the best drawing in the world. Everything's crushed. So these carbon atoms kind of have nowhere to fit. So as you crush it down, it's getting denser and harder, but what's happening basically is it's getting extremely brittle. That's no good. We don't want it to be extremely brittle, because then it's gonna crack as you're working on it, and it's gonna be unstable. Okay, so let me take a pause here, regather my thoughts, because I'm very passionate about this. So when we heat this up, right, to hammer it, so you're saying, oh, well, why can't I hammer it cold? Isn't it the same thing? We're crushing the structure to be more dense. We can't do that because these in between lines, the structure is getting all messed up. It's getting all crunched. By heating it, we're softening it up. We're softening the structure. Now what happens when we do that? You want to keep it at like a cherry red color when you hammer it, up to an orange. I see a lot of people, they go up until it's almost white hot and they start hammering. Then, like in the movies, for dramatic effect, you see sparks coming out from steel. When you take it out of the fire, the metal is sizzling. It's shooting off sparks. If you stop and think, what are those sparks? Those sparks are your carbon atoms leaving the metal. Once those are gone, it's almost impossible to put them back. So now we've lost a couple checkers, right? We could be down to a 1055 even from overheating the metal. So let's forget annealing for a minute and pretend we're at the forge. So we're at the forge, and let me put this marker away. We're at the forge, and I have my material, okay? So there's two types of knife making. I'll keep it simple to knife making here. Two types. There's stock removal, and there's actual forging. Both stock removal and forging for a forged blade come into play, and it's important to understand what you're doing when it comes to your initial steps, okay? So let's pretend I just got this off the shelf. If I recall, this blank is already hardened because I'm ready for stock removal. And you can hear it almost sounds like glass. This one has been tempered already, so it has a lower tone. This sounds like glass. This has a little lower tone, but it's heat treated and tempered. Okay, so we have our blank steel. Forge, get it nice and hot. Some people want to heat up the anvil surface. You can do that too. That's going to let you work the blade longer. First, once we put it in the fire, the annealing doesn't matter unless you're doing stock removal, then heat treating. You can skip annealing when you're forging, but if you're doing a stock removal only, let's say from a rectangle, and you're going to cut it, and then you're going to sand it down into a blade, the annealing is important because it's not very fun sanding a piece of hardened steel. And as you're doing that, friction creates heat. So you're on the sander, and you want to keep this as hard as possible, thinking that, okay, if I can just sand this down, I don't need to do any heat treating and I'm all set. But you're creating pockets of heat from friction along the whole edge of the blade and your whole piece of material, and that can heat up until orange, red, and as soon as that happens, the blade is soft. Your material is soft. Now, it won't chip, but you're not going to hold an edge. So we're finding a balance between durability and edge retention with our process here. So that kind of explains stock removal. So forging, and I probably said this already 4 or 5 times, forget annealing. So let's get into it. First, you got everything warmed up, ready to go. You put your piece of steel in there. We want to form a tip, okay? So, like I said before, it's not going to matter if we lose the original temper from the original piece of steel. Now, you can't reforge an already tempered piece of steel that you've tempered. You're going to lose more hardness. That's a little bit more complicated. Pretty much right now what we want to do is form a tip. So heat this up to orange. I can take it, let it cool down. I can sand out my tip, or I can forge out my tip and hammer it down and bring out a tip. Okay? Then we hammer out our bevel, which is some people like a hollow grind. I like a hand forged grind. We hammer that out so that we widen our piece of material. kind of like this one, is completely hand forged. As you can see, this, well, you can't see, this started out as like a brick, kind of like this size. So we had a thick piece of steel, spring steel, reduced down to this kind of spine length or width, and it's been forged out. So back to the drawing board here. What are we doing? I've kind of crushed my checkerboard down to an unstable state. Everything is out of whack, but we're okay because I've allowed for expansion. So what we're looking at that molecular level, I hate saying that word, so bear with me. Is something like this. So it's not quite as crushed as this one because that one started out without any expansion. So we still have an unstable structure here that we've hammered down. With basically, I've heated this up to soften it and did my bevel, my edge, and the tip. Okay. You can hammer this out too. You can do the stock removal later too. If you're completely hand forging, you're going to be doing all this on the forge, on the anvil. So everything here at a base structure looks kind of like this. It's not crushed because we've softened it, and it's going to stay in that state. So how do we fix that? Well, that's where the meat and potatoes come in of heat treating. So I've done all my forging. Blade looks like this, but it's soft. That's a good time to go and do your stock removal and sanding and get everything ready to go. Now we got to treat it. So what I'm gonna do is fire up the forge again, or if it's left on, you just leave it on. And I kind of want to put it in up until this point, because I'm worried about the edge more so than the grip, because the grip is not retaining an edge. What's the benefit of that? Well, we're keeping this somewhat soft. If you ever seen a knife snap off here, right at the handle, it's because the whole blade is hardened, usually on a factory line or something like that. So this is my personal philosophy, my technique. So I'm kind of leaving this a little bit cold. It's still 700-800 degrees, but I'm gonna let it air cool before I drop it in my oil. Some people like to preheat their oil, some people use water. I like use motor oil. That works best for me. So I bring it into the forge up to this point here, and I've heated it up, and we think that we're ready to just drop it in the oil when it's got up to orange. You'll see that in the movies too. This is wrong. The key is you want to heat this up to a non-magnetic, and I pull it out and let it air cool. Now, many years ago, I used to belong to a group on a forum called anvilfire.com. Very good information back in the day before we had Facebook and everything like that. And one of the people on there was a descendant of the original creator of Buck Knives, and he said he was deleting his account for whatever reason, and he gave away his formula. So I'm going to give that to you today. If you've been watching this long, I think you deserve it, because I have no script and I'm just talking off the top of my head. So thank you for following along. So he explained the original Buck Knives. I'm not talking about the current ones, the originals. What they would do is they would put the steel, bring it out, non-magnetic, let it air cool, in a process called normalization. So, in this category here, we got annealing. Very important process, but not always applicable, because we're already doing that when we forge. Then we have heat treating and tempering. So normalization is a process of heat treating, in my book at least. I could be wrong on the way that other people term it, but that's what I call it, heat treating, because we're bringing the steel back from this to this, right? So I mentioned earlier, and I'll get back on track, in the movies when you see the sparks flying out, very easy to happen in a coal forge, but you can monitor that better in a gas forge. Past that magnetic, when you start to get into your white heat, you're going to start to get that fizzle, which is your carbon falling out. I don't want that. I don't want to see the sparks flying when I'm hammering. I don't want to see any sparks when I'm forging. That was explained to me on that forum. So anyway, basically what's going to happen next, we think we're done, but that first normalization did not bring me back fully to a stable structure, okay? But it brought me to something like this. Let me draw one more thing so I can explain that too. So we did one normalization, and that brings us to here, okay? It's starting to take shape again. But how's my blade gonna last? You know, everybody wants to chop concrete and bamboo and cut paper and cardboard and things that they're not supposed to do with their knife. I've done a lot of testing with my blades to determine what they can do with basically scrap metal. I have real stock that isn't scrap. But anyway, so we first normalization, after we're done forging, it's kind of like this. Then we go here where you can see some of the structures coming back to normal. What's the importance of this? When this is all crushed, you know, we start out here, get to here, now we're at our first normalization here. This being the carbon atom within the structure, again, the carbon giving us our strength in the blade, giving us our toughness, our hardness. These are squeezed tight in between these checkers. So when I've hammered it, you can see the ample space around the piece of carbon. when I've hammered it, what's happened is this carbon atom is stuck in there. It's tight, and that's creating tension. And again, I'm going to say it molecular level. It's creating tension. That's what's causing the blade to snap. So the guy from Buck Knives explained he does 3 of these normalization processes. If you watch I Hate the Show, Forge and Fire, well, I don't hate the show. I don't like being compared to it because that's a whole different world. I've been doing this before the show. Each time we normalize, we're coming back to square one. So for the sake of me not drawing again, let's say this is number 1 normalization. This is number 2, and then we got our 3rd, right? So now, even though I've normalized the blade, everything's still soft because we have all this space around each one of our carbon atoms that's making it soft. It's not connected to each other. They're not connected. These circles, these checkers are not touching. They have space between them. So that gives the base structure the ability to bend. So how do we do that? So we've heat treated. Now we need to temper. So before we temper, we harden. Hardening is probably the trickiest part of the whole process. And there's different philosophies and folklore and different things. And from what I've read, using virgin olive oil is the best to temper a blade. What we don't want is rapid cooling. So it's ideal to kind of get so I'm just going to stick to oil. I'm just going to refer to oil, but we want to get your oil up to a close enough temperature where, again with the chart, these squares don't close too fast. Because if that were to happen, the carbon atom is going to get squeezed real tight again. We don't want that. We want to slow that process down. So you take a piece of scrap metal, heat it up in the forge, similar color to your blade, and I like to put that in the oil. I don't get exact with the temperatures, but we don't want it to be freezing cold. We're not tempering in snow. And if you watch the show, Forge and Fire, you'll see a lot of people temper in water, and you see the judges cringing and wincing, saying, "Oh, I can't believe he's tempering in water." I say the same thing, because if you understand the molecular structure like I'm explaining to you the best I can, you can understand what I mean by you don't want to cool too fast. So essentially, I want to bring the metal up to just above a cherry red. I think that's perfect. And that's what the Buck Knives guy from the forum explained. Just above a cherry red. And you want to be able to see that heat expansion throughout the entire blade, okay? Because the forge is not going to heat up the blade perfect in every spot. So I bring it above a cherry red because the heat likes to travel, okay? So I do this at night so I can see the color, and I pull it out of the forge We're at like a dull orange, it's still bright, but it's like not a not quite orange, not quite red. We'll put it that way. Take it out, and if you can remember about heating the surface of the anvil to keep your heat, the heat is escaping from the metal. You only have a certain amount of time to do this. So once I see that expansion of the color, let's say here is bright orange and here is a dull orange, I want to see this whole thing be that dull orange, and then it's going to reduce down to that cherry red I explained. Now I'm going to drop that in the oil. We're not mixing it. It's not a vat of soup or coffee or chocolate. You leave it in one spot. That brings me into warping. I'll briefly go over warping, but it goes hand in hand with rapid cooling. So let's say, I don't know, part of the oil is a little bit colder than one part of the oil, and the blade's not perfectly spread out with the heat. When I drop that in, whatever's colder, whatever side has lost heat the most, what's going to happen is it's going to condense faster than the other side can condense. The checkers, the squares, are going to condense unevenly. You get a warp. You'll see that a lot with water quenching. So for the sake of time, we've dropped the blade into the oil to about here. Okay? So what about this? Well, that's soft. We kind of want that to be. Even if you drop it to here, that's okay too. I like to go here because this is going to be a reference point for my final part of this whole thing. I've let it cool. Now, once it's been in there about a minute, 2 minutes, then you can do your mixing. You can flip it, put it in there. The surface of that oil is going to catch fire most likely. That's a good sign. That means it was hot enough. But because I've preheated the oil, let's say to 100 degrees for the sake of the argument, that cooling is still rapid. However, it's not as rapid as if it was freezing oil or just room temperature oil, going from 1100, 1300 degrees down to 50 degrees. Say it's 100 degrees. These squares, rather than closing like this, they're closing like this. So they're closing gently around the carbon atoms in your blade, because you don't want to lose any carbon. Pull it out. You got a hardened blade, hopefully. You do your little preliminary test, the file test, make sure it skates off, etc. A lot of different little caveats can fool you to whether it's hardened or not. So with the oil, you're going to have a surface of not the same carbon, the same, but not what I'm talking about. You're going to have a layer of carbon, which is going to be over the coating of the blade. It's going to coat it. You're going to have to sand that off. If I go to skate the file off of the edge, you're going to see it's going to leave a mark because it's taking the carbon off. If you see a line or something, very shallow when you do that hardness test, that's okay. We're looking for that it's not digging into the steel, basically. We're not trying to go down deep with the edge of the file, but you can tell if it's skating off or not. Again, you know, the not again, I didn't say it yet, and I'm kind of losing track here, but the file is a lot harder than the steel, because let's say this is a 1095 or 1085. Let's say it has a Rockwell hardness of 54. The Rockwell hardness of the file will be like 65, 70. These numbers are not researched or anything. These are just ones I kind of remember. So we got our hardened blade. Blade's hard and ready to do the final part, tempering. So what are we doing with the tempering? Okay, so great, our edge is hard, but the whole blade is hard. Okay, so I'm just gonna stick to because this video is getting a little lengthy, I'm gonna stick to what I do. Pretty much, we want our blade to be hard up to about here. We want some flexibility in the spine. You're going to have a bigger spine ratio to edge ratio, and that's going to be, let's say, split it into thirds the best you can. So 1/3 the edge hard, and 2/3 you want to remove some of this hardness. So how are we going to do that? Well, I do what was recommended to me on the forum, and it's worked for many years for me. A spine temper. So you take a torch, and there's a color scale. You can kind of see the colors ranging from dark brown, and then we'll go to a peacock purplish color, to a blue, to a light blue, and then it's going to go kind of like silver until it reaches a temperature where it starts to turn slightly red. So at that brown level, which you will be able to see when you start to do the spine temper, that's where what I mentioned before about hardening up to here comes into play. Because I kind of want to chase the heat up to the tip, and it's tricky because I'm using a blowtorch. MAP gas is good. If I was to start here in this area on the blade to heat and chase my temper, you're gonna have the heat expand too much too fast, and you're gonna ruin your edge, because that heat is gonna bleed down to the edge, and the edge is thinner than the spine of the blade. Okay, so it takes a lot less time for the edge of your blade to get ruined than it does for the spine to absorb that heat and let you chase it down. So an old machinist explained to me, you can mitigate rust if you bring the metal to a straw brown, and that will give you enough of a temper to keep your blade durable but still have enough flex to it. So I'll start the blowtorch here, okay? Because I've hardened here. This is already the softness that I want. This isn't going to be doing anything except shock absorption. I hit this with the torch here. The heat starts to build up. and then I start to feather my way down. So now, because I've got the grip cut out here, I have this whole chunk of steel that gives me some time to push up to here before it expands down to the edge of the blade. So an acceptable color for me would be to start fanning my blowtorch here. I start to see the slightest change in color. I chase that heat up, and now it's going to follow the torch. What I'm doing is bringing that up to here. Around here, we'll get up to that dark blue peacock color, and it could turn a little bit white, light blue. That's okay, because I'd rather this bend right here than snap. But I do care about the edge of my blade. So if you want to get fancy, you can keep the edge in some water while you do this. I freestyle it. I just go for it. I chase it up to here, and what's going to happen, this area here is going to get to that peacock color, and down on the edge of my blade will be that straw color. Now if I leave it unchecked and don't dip it in water to cool it, that peacock color is going to do its thing and come to the edge of the blade. I'm going to have a soft blade. So essentially, once that's done, if you retained all this, you've got yourself a heat treated and a tempered blade. This blade here was a combination of forging and stock removal. To harvest this, what I used was an angle grinder to cut it off to get the basic shape, because this shape here is more of a freestyled shape from the hammer itself. This, I want it to be a specific type of blade, a Bowie knife. So it's important to get that cut outline. So this is a already tempered piece of steel that came from the sawmill blade, as I explained. So I lost hardness. In that whole process, the blade itself went from whatever hardness it was down to, I don't know, maybe a few steps below what it was. So it's a big question and mystery. Can this be tempered because it's already a processed piece of metal? And the answer is yes. And that's a whole different process. I'll go over that another time. But final note, if you're harvesting metal, I found that these 1800s, early 1900s sawmill blades are very good steel, and they contain a little bit of nickel, which adds to the rust resistance and a little bit of durability. Stainless steel knives, not a fan of them, but people like them because they don't rust, and that's why people tend to stay away from carbon steel knives, or get a carbon steel knife that's coated with Teflon or some sort of other coating. But what I can tell you here is that I've kept this blade maintained and oiled, and I've seen little to no rust. I'm not sure if I want to give away my secret about my little rust treatment process that I do, but I hope this video kind of gives you an idea, if you can keep with my scattered brain and the way I talk, how heat treatment works, annealing, tempering, hardening, all that. So hopefully once all the snow melts, we got about 3 feet of snow out here, I can go to the forge and make a video and kind of put these ideas in practice and show everything that I'm talking about, because it's a little hard to explain, but I wanted to kind of make this first part 1 video to go over those basic concepts so that when I'm forging, when I'm forging, you can refer to this video and I don't have to go fully in depth about everything, and I can just kind of do the work and show you what's going on. Thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great week.